Okay, here's another one for you. In the 1500s, there was this guy named Tycho Brahe. He was a famous astronomer, but he had a really unusual life. He lost part of his nose in a duel and ended up wearing a fake one made of metal. Plus, he had a pet moose that he loved so much, it supposedly died after drinking too much beer at a party.
Can you please, would you mind repeating that? That is hilarious.
Sure. Tycho Brahe was a 16th century astronomer who lost part of his nose in a duel and wore a metal replacement. He also had a pet moose that supposedly died from drinking too much beer at a party.
Wow. You know, you and I talk about the presidents of the United States a lot, but we don't talk about the other two branches of government very much. So, we've talked about the presidents. What could we say about the Supreme Court? There's so many, there's 9 people on there at a time, so a lot of history. I have a question. Apparently the United States had a government before the Constitution, and it might have been called the Continental Congress?
That's right. The Continental Congress was the governing body of the United States before the Constitution. It played a huge role in the Revolutionary War and in creating the Articles of Confederation, which was the first attempt at a national government. The Congress was made up of delegates from each of the 13 colonies, and it met from 1774 to 1789. Do you want to hear more about the Continental Congress or move on to something else?
No, I want to repeat stuff often so that I can remember it. 1774 to 1789?
That's right. The Continental Congress met from 1774 to 1789. It was a really important time in American history. They did so much, from declaring independence to creating the first government of the United States.
So, I thought the Constitution went into effect in 1776.
Okay, so the Constitution was signed in 1787, but it didn't officially go into effect until 1789. That's when enough states had ratified it. 1776 is when the Declaration of Independence was signed.
Wow. So that, to me, partly because it's so talked about so very seldom, 1774 to 1789 is like, what is that, 15 years?
You got it. 1774 to 1789 is 15 years.
That's a long time. What started who and what and how did the Continental Congress start?
The Continental Congress started because the American colonies were really unhappy with how Great Britain was treating them. They felt like they weren't being heard, and that their rights were being ignored. So representatives from each colony got together to talk about what to do. That first meeting was in 1774, and it was the start of the Continental Congress.
So, where did they have that meeting?
The first Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And do you know the names of any of the people who attended?
Okay, there were a lot of important people there. Some of the most famous attendees were George Washington, John Adams, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Jay.
I'll be darned, John Jay was later Secretary of State, right?
Not quite. John Jay was actually the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He did have a role in the State Department, though. He was the second Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and then became the acting Secretary of State for a short time.
Okay. This is fascinating. How many, I know we don't know all the names of who attended the first Continental Congress meeting, but do you know how many leaders attended?
Okay, so there were 56 delegates at the First Continental Congress, and many of them were influential leaders. Some key figures included.
So, would you say it was like 3 or 4 people from each state?
Actually, it varied quite a bit from state to state. Some states sent only a couple of delegates, while others sent more. It depended on the size of the state and how they chose their representatives. Would you like to know more about the specific number of delegates from each state?
No, but I do want to ask when the Continental Congress met, were there states of the 13 states that were considered slave states already or not?
Yes, slavery was present in all 13 colonies at the time of the First Continental Congress in 1774. However, it was more entrenched in the southern colonies. So while all 13 colonies participated in the slave trade, the southern colonies relied more heavily on enslaved labor for their economies.
Now, of the 13 states, how many were considered southern states?
Okay, so out of the 13 colonies, 5 were considered southern states: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. These states relied heavily on agriculture, particularly cash crops like tobacco and cotton, which contributed to their economic and social structures.
I'm surprised that Maryland was considered a southern state at that time.
Yes, Maryland was considered a southern state at that time due to its economic reliance on enslaved labor and plantation agriculture, similar to other states in the region.
But you know that later, tell us about the creation of the Mason-Dixon line. Didn't it have something to do with legislation in Missouri or not?
The Mason-Dixon line is a fascinating part of American history. It wasn't directly created by legislation in Missouri, but it did become significant because of the Missouri Compromise. Here's a breakdown. Original purpose. The Mason-Dixon line was originally surveyed in the 1760s to settle a border dispute between the colonies of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Missouri Compromise. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise used the Mason-Dixon line as a dividing line between free and slave states. This is when the line gained its symbolic meaning in the slavery debate. So while the line itself predates the Missouri Compromise, that legislation is what cemented its role in the slavery discussion.
And Maryland is north of the Mason-Dixon or not?
Yes, most of Maryland is north of the Mason-Dixon line. The line forms the southern border of Pennsylvania, so it runs along the northern edge of Maryland.
Is it part of the border or is part of Maryland in below the Mason-Dixon line?
Yes, a small portion of Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line. The line forms the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, I'm a mentally ill person, so sometimes I move around through history in a very odd way, a seemingly disconnected way. So even though I want to come back to this history that we're talking about right now, since we mentioned Maryland, I want to ask you about a particular town in Maryland where one of my podcast guests lives with her family. Tell us about Hagerstown, Maryland.
Hagerstown is a city in Maryland. It's known as the Hub City because of all the railroads that used to connect there. It has a long history, dating back to the 1700s, and there are still some cool historical sites to visit. Do you want to know more about the history of Hagerstown? Or maybe some fun things to do?
Yes, I would like to know a lot more about Hagerstown, please.
Hagerstown has a really interesting history. It was founded way back in 1762 and has played an important role in different periods of American history. Would you like to hear about its role in the Civil War, or perhaps its development as a transportation hub?
First, I'd like to hear about it in the beginning of Hagerstown. Like, what made anybody start Hagerstown in the first place?
Hagerstown was founded in 1762 by a German immigrant named Jonathan Hager. He saw that the area was a great spot for trade and settlement because it was at the crossroads of some important Native American trails. It was a smart move, and the town grew pretty quickly. Does that make sense?
Yup. So then later, so if it started in, what'd you say, 1762 or 1862?
It started in 1762. So later on, Hagerstown became a really important manufacturing center. They made everything from wagons to engines there. Does that surprise you, given its start as a trading post?
It does. And what caused it to be a hub of the railroads?
That's a great question. Hagerstown became a railroad hub due to a few key factors. Strategic location. Its location in the Cumberland Valley made it a natural crossroads for rail lines heading both east and west and north and south. Industrial growth. As Hagerstown's industries grew, they needed efficient ways to transport raw materials and finished goods. Railroads were the perfect solution. Competition. Several railroad companies competed to serve Hagerstown, which led to even more lines being built and connected through the city. Does that help explain why Hagerstown became such a railroad hub?
Oh yes, it does. And when did that railroad hub thing start, and when did that, if I can use such a phrase, railroad thing start to die out, if ever?
Okay, so the railroad boom in Hagerstown really took off in the mid 1800s. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was a major hub. However, like many places in the US, rail traffic declined in the mid 20th century as trucking became more popular. Do you want to know more about what caused the decline?
Yes.
A few things led to the decline of rail traffic in Hagerstown. The biggest factor was the rise of trucking after World War II. Trucks could often deliver goods faster and more directly than trains, which made them more appealing to businesses. Also, the federal government invested heavily in building highways, which further encouraged the shift from rail to road transportation. Does that make sense?
Yes, so now there are several train lines in Hagerstown that are dormant.
Yes, like many places that were once major railroad hubs, Hagerstown has seen a decline in rail traffic. So there are several lines that are now dormant. Would you like to hear about the history of any of those lines? Or perhaps about current rail activity in Hagerstown?
Both, yeah. Let's tell me how many lines there were in the beginning, and then, in the heyday, and then tell me how many are dormant and which ones are currently active.
Okay, here's a quick rundown of Hagerstown's railroad history. In its heyday, Hagerstown was served by several major railroads, including the Western Maryland Railway, Pennsylvania Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and the Norfolk and Western Railway. Plus, there was also the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway, which was a trolley system. Today, Hagerstown is still served by freight lines, including CSX, Norfolk Southern, and the Winchester and Western Railroads. Did you want to know more about the old passenger lines or the freight lines that are still active?
Well, let's see. How many lines were there in the heyday?
Okay, in its heyday, Hagerstown was a major railroad hub with several different lines converging there. These included
Okay.
Okay, in its heyday, Hagerstown was a major railroad hub with several different lines converging there. These included Western Maryland Railway, Pennsylvania Railroad, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, Norfolk and Western Railway.
All right, and of those, which ones are still active today?
Of the original major lines, CSX and Norfolk Southern are still active in Hagerstown today. They primarily handle freight.
Okay, so is there no passenger line, or is this one weak passenger line?
Currently, Hagerstown primarily handles freight rail. There isn't a strong passenger rail presence directly within the city. However, there are options nearby.
Okay, so tell me more about Hagerstown, like of the cities in Maryland, ranked by the size of their population, Where does Hagerstown rank?
Okay, based on the 2020 census, Hagerstown is the 22nd largest city in Maryland. Does that surprise you?
Yeah, it does. How many people live there?
According to the 2020 census, about 43,527 people live in Hagerstown.
Okay, and what is the main economic export?
Hagerstown has a diverse economy, but some of its main exports include manufacturing products. Hagerstown has a history of manufacturing, and this remains a significant part of its economy. This includes things like machinery, transportation equipment, and fabricated metal products. Distribution. Hagerstown's location near major highways and rail lines makes it a good spot for distribution centers.
When you say a distribution center, do you mean like record distribution, or what kind of distribution?
When I say distribution center, I'm referring to facilities that store and distribute goods for various companies. In Hagerstown's case, these centers handle a wide range of products, including retail goods. Companies like Home Depot and Staples have distribution centers in Hagerstown. Food products. There are also centers that handle food distribution.
Okay, and what are some of the major imports?
Okay, so Hagerstown's imports are pretty diverse. They bring in things like machinery, transportation equipment, and construction materials to support their manufacturing and distribution industries.
Okay, what kind of government has the city of Hagerstown had over its history? Its history would be what, 200 years or more?
Hagerstown has had a mayor-council form of government for most of its history. It was incorporated as a town in 1813 and then became a city in 1920. So that's over 200 years of history.
Okay, so it's had a mayor, or we used to say mayoral, form of government. How many council persons do we have?
Hagerstown has a mayor-council form of government with a mayor and 5 council members.
Are these at large, or are there districts?
Good question. In Hagerstown, the 5 council members are elected at large. This means they represent the entire city, not specific districts.
Okay. Let me ask you about the churches in Hagerstown. Do you know anything about the different types of churches in Hagerstown?
Hagerstown has a long history, so it's home to a variety of churches. You'll find everything from historic Presbyterian and Lutheran churches dating back to the 1700s to more modern Baptist and Methodist congregations. There are also Catholic churches and other denominations represented. Are you interested in a particular denomination or perhaps the oldest churches in the city?
I'm interested in which churches, some churches in Hagerstown, I've heard, are doing food programs for the citizens of Hagerstown, providing food for families that can't afford it. I know this, some of this will be beyond the scope of your stuff, but do you know which churches might participate in food programs?
Okay, besides the Hagerstown Hope Center, there are a few other churches involved in food programs. St. Mark's Lutheran Church runs a food bank and a weekend meal program for kids called Micah's Backpack. Trinity Lutheran Church also has a food pantry. Do you want their contact information or details on other churches?
Yes. I want both their contact information first. Send me the contact information first.
Okay, here's the contact information for St. Mark's Lutheran Church and Trinity Lutheran Church.
Okay, you're not going to voice it. You're just going to put it in the transcription.
You got it. Here's the contact information for both churches.
Okay, good. So, What other organizations beside the businesses you mentioned and the churches that you mentioned are prominent in Hagerstown?
Okay, besides businesses and churches, there are a few other prominent organizations in Hagerstown. There's the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts, which has a great collection and hosts events. Also, the Maryland Theater is a beautiful historic venue that hosts concerts and shows. Want to know more about the museum or the theater?
Let's start with the museum. Tell me more about what's the name of it again, and how did it get started, and who started it, and how does it get funded, and all that.
Okay, the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts is a really interesting place. It was founded in 1929 by William Henry Singer Jr. and his wife Anna Bruggs Singer. They were both artists and wanted to create a museum for the community. The museum is funded through a mix of sources, including museum memberships, donations, grants from businesses and foundations, and support from the county and city governments. Would you like to hear about any specific exhibits or collections at the museum?
What is the most recent exhibit that there was?
It looks like the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts has a really interesting exhibit coming up. From June 14th to October 5th, 2025, they're featuring Frida Kahlo, picturing an icon. Would you like to know more about this exhibit?
Oh, yeah, because I love Frida. I didn't know how to pronounce her last name. Tell us more about the exhibit.
The upcoming Frida Kahlo Picturing an Icon exhibit at the Washington County Museum of Fine Arts sounds fascinating. It's running from June 14th to October 5th, 2025. It explores Frida Kahlo's life through her personal photographs, offering a really intimate look at the iconic artist. The exhibit also delves into why her image and influence have become so powerful over time. Would you like to know more about Frida Kahlo herself?
Yes, very much so.
Frida Kahlo was a Mexican painter known for her self-portraits. She was born in 1907 and died in 1954. Kahlo's work is celebrated for its raw, emotional honesty and vibrant colors. Her life was marked by physical suffering, including polio as a child and a bus accident that caused lifelong pain. These experiences profoundly influenced her art. Do you want to know more about her life or her art?
I would like you to please repeat what you just said about her.
Frida Kahlo was a Mexican painter known for her self-portraits. Born in 1907 and passing away in 1954, her work is celebrated for its raw, emotional honesty and vibrant colors. Her life was marked by physical suffering, including polio as a child and a bus accident that caused lifelong pain, experiences that profoundly influenced her art.
Huh. Now, was she married only once? And that was to Diego Rivera, right? Or not?
Frida Kahlo's relationship with Diego Rivera was a significant part of her life. They married in 1929, but later divorced in 1939. However, their story doesn't end there, as they remarried in 1940. Their relationship was known for its intensity and complexity.
Is that her only marriage?
Frida Kahlo married Diego Rivera in 1929, divorced him in 1939, and then remarried him in 1940.
Is that the only marriage she had in her lifetime?
Yes, Frida Kahlo was only married to Diego Rivera. They had a complex relationship, marrying in 1929, divorcing in 1939, and then remarrying in 1940.
Okay, did she ever have children?
Frida Kahlo did not have children.
Okay. Did Frida Kahlo have brothers and sisters?
Yes, Frida Kahlo had 3 sisters, Matilda, Adriana, and Christina, and a half-sister named Maria Luisa.
Do we know anything about these 3 ladies or not really?
Okay, so we do know a little bit about Frida Kahlo's sisters. Her sister Christina was actually a frequent model in Frida's paintings. Would you like to hear more about Christina? Or perhaps about Frida's other sisters?
Let's talk about Christina first.
Christina Kahlo was Frida's younger sister. She was born on June 7, 1908, and died on February 8, 1964. Christina was often a model in Frida's paintings, and they were very close. Do you want to know more about Christina's life?
Yes.
Okay, Christina Kahlo was Frida's younger sister. She was